The moment my marriage ended started with a pen. Not a fight, not a betrayal confession, not even a divorce paper. Just a platinum fountain pen rolling across a conference table, and the way my husband looked at me when it stopped at my feet. My name is Laura Chen. I'm 32 years old. I'm a software engineer. And until recently, I spent 7 years building a company worth $3.2 billion for a man who pretended I didn't exist. That man was my husband, Daniel Carter, the CEO of Henderson Solutions, the face on the magazine covers, the visionary founder. At least, that's what the world believed. What they didn't know was that every single system running that company, the AI infrastructure, the algorithms, the architecture holding the entire business together, was written by me, line by line, night after night, year after year. While Daniel attended conferences, shook hands with investors, and posed for Forbes magazine photos, I was the one sitting in dark rooms with glowing monitors, making sure the company actually worked. But none of that mattered in the boardroom that Tuesday morning, because in Daniel's world, titles mattered more than truth. And my title? Officially, Senior Systems Engineer. Unofficially, invisible. The boardroom was the kind that screamed money. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking downtown. A 12-foot marble conference table. Leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car. Daniel stood at the head of the table, presenting quarterly results to the executives like a general addressing his army. He looked perfect. Tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks, that confident smile investors loved. Meanwhile, I sat at the end of the table near the door, the seat that quietly tells everyone who matters and who doesn't. He was explaining growth projections when it happened. The pen slipped from his fingers. It was one of those absurd luxury pens Daniel loved collecting, platinum, custom engraved, probably worth more than my monthly grocery bill. The pen rolled slowly across the glossy surface of the table. Everyone watched it. The room went silent. And when it stopped right beside my shoe. Daniel's eyes followed it. Then they lifted and landed on me, not beside me. On me, like I was an employee, like I was staff, like I was nothing. Pick it up, he said. 2 words. Cold. Casual. Dismissive. Not Laura. Not could you. Just a command. The way someone talks to an assistant. Or a janitor. Or furniture. The room froze. Richard, the CFO, paused mid-sip of his coffee. Diane from operations stopped typing. Marcus from marketing leaned back in his chair with a grin forming on his face. Everyone was waiting to see what I would do. For a split second, I considered leaving the pen on the floor, or kicking it across the room, or reminding everyone in that room that without me, their entire company would collapse overnight. But instead, I smiled, slowly bent down, picked up the pen, and placed it gently back on the table in front of him. "There you go," I said calmly. Then I added, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Your Majesty." The boardroom exploded with laughter. Real laughter. The kind that fills a room and tells you exactly where you stand. Marcus slapped the table. Diane covered her mouth. Even Richard, the man who hadn't smiled once in 3 years, was chuckling into his coffee. Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't thank me either. He simply took the pen and continued his presentation, as if I were nothing more than part of the furniture. But humiliation has a strange side effect. It clarifies things. Because as I sat there listening to my husband explain the success of a company I had built, something inside me finally broke. Not in anger, not in sadness. In clarity. For 7 years, I had been building an empire, and Daniel believed it belonged to him. What he didn't understand was that you can't own something you don't understand. And Daniel Carter had never understood the systems I built, not once, which meant he had no idea that buried deep inside the company's infrastructure was something I had written years ago, a system called Failsafe Alpha, a piece of code designed to protect the company in case of catastrophe. What Daniel didn't know was that I was the catastrophe. And by midnight that night, his entire empire would begin collapsing. One server, one contract, $1 billion at a time. If you had met me 10 years ago, you probably would have described me the same way most people still do the first time they see me. Quiet, capable, observant. The kind of woman who doesn't need to dominate a room to understand everything happening inside it. I was 22 when I met Daniel. At the time, I was finishing my computer science degree, surviving on instant noodles, caffeine, and the kind of stubborn ambition that makes you forget to sleep. Daniel was in the business school, working on his MBA, already polished in a way I found both impressive and slightly intimidating. He always looked like he was arriving from somewhere important. Crisp shirts, expensive watch, easy confidence. The kind of man who could make a conversation sound like an opportunity. We met in the campus library because he was sitting at the only table with an open power outlet. I remember standing there with my laptop in one hand and charger in the other, already exhausted from a week of deadlines, when he looked up and smiled. "You can use this side," he said, moving his books. "I promise I only take up half the table and 80% of the oxygen." I laughed. That was the first thing he gave me before he gave me anything else. The feeling that being around him was easy. We started talking in whispers, then over coffee, then over late-night walks back to our dorm buildings. Daniel had ideas for everything. Markets, growth, positioning, venture capital. I had never met someone who could speak so passionately about the future. When I told him about distributed systems, security architecture, and the kind of software I wanted to build, he didn't glaze over the way other people sometimes did. He leaned in. He asked questions. He made me feel brilliant. "You build the machine," he told me one night, sitting on the library steps under a yellow campus light. "I'll make the world pay attention to it." At 22, that sounded romantic. At 32, I know it was also a warning. Back then, though, it felt like destiny. We dated through our last year of school. We were the kind of couple people pointed to and said things like, "They're going to build something big." Daniel loved saying that we were a perfect match because we brought opposite strengths to the same dream. He had the confidence, the family network, the pitch-perfect charisma. I had the patience, the technical precision, and the ability to disappear into a problem until I solved it. After graduation, we moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment with thin walls, unreliable plumbing, and a kitchen so small we couldn't both stand in it at the same time. It should have felt miserable. Instead, it felt like the beginning of everything. I wrote code at our secondhand dining table for 16 hours a day, sometimes barefoot, sometimes wrapped in an old gray hoodie, sometimes too tired to remember whether I'd eaten lunch. Daniel built slide decks, emailed investors, took calls on the balcony, and came back inside flushed with adrenaline, saying things like, "They loved the vision," or "Give me another week, we're close." We lived on takeout and hope. When the first small investment came through, Daniel opened a bottle of cheap champagne and kissed me in the middle of our cluttered apartment. "This is ours," he said, smiling against my mouth. "Every bit of it. 50-50. We do this together." And I believed him. I believed him when he said the paperwork was temporary. I believed him when he said it would be simpler to register the company under one name first. I believed him when he promised mine would be added after the first funding round. Then after the second. Then after the first major client. Then after the legal restructuring. Then after the merger talks. Every excuse arrived wrapped in logic, timing, strategy. Every delay sounded reasonable if you loved him enough. And I did. That was my mistake. The company grew faster than either of us expected. Henderson Solutions went from a fragile startup in a cramped apartment to a serious player in tech consulting. Our first office had stained carpet and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired. I loved it anyway. It smelled like possibility. I spent nights there alone, curled over my keyboard, building systems that Daniel would later describe to investors as the engine of our competitive edge. He never technically lied. He just learned how to tell the truth in a way that erased me. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't interested in magazine covers. I didn't care whose face ended up in press photos. I cared about the work, the architecture, the elegance of building something powerful enough to outlast us both. And Daniel knew that. He knew exactly how to use the parts of me I thought were strengths. My patience became permission. My loyalty became leverage. My silence became convenience. By the time we got married, Henderson Solutions had already become Daniel's kingdom in the public eye. His surname was attached to every introduction. Investors loved him. Journalists quoted him. His family adored the story of their brilliant son leading a rising tech empire. I was introduced differently. "This is Laura," Daniel would say, one hand light against my back. "She's the technical genius who helps make all of this possible." Helps. That word stayed with me. Not built, not created, not designed. Helped. Like I was assisting in the construction of my own life. Daniel's family followed his lead. They were always polite to me, always warm in that controlled way wealthy families can be when they've decided you're acceptable, but not central. His mother once told me over dinner, "It's wonderful that Daniel has a wife who understands how to support a man with that level of ambition." I smiled and passed the salad. I didn't say, "I am the ambition." I didn't say, "This company breathes because I built its lungs." I didn't say anything at all. That was another mistake. Because little by little, year by year, silence hardens into a role. And before I understood what was happening, I had become a supporting character in the story of my own creation. Looking back now, the warning signs were everywhere. Not dramatic ones. Nothing that would make you immediately pack a suitcase and walk away. Just small things. Quiet shifts. Little moments that taken alone seemed harmless, but together slowly built the atmosphere of something wrong. The first time I noticed it clearly was about 3 years into the company's growth. Henderson Solutions had just landed its first major enterprise contract. We were still operating out of that cramped office with stained carpets and flickering lights. But suddenly there were investors visiting, clients flying in, reporters asking for interviews. Daniel loved it. He moved through those rooms like he had been born for them. Perfect smile, perfect handshake, perfect answers. I stayed mostly in the back, watching the system dashboards on my laptop to make sure nothing crashed, while Daniel promised things to clients that only my code could deliver. One evening after a meeting, an investor approached Daniel while I was packing up my laptop. "Your infrastructure is impressive," the man said. "Who designed the architecture?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Our team," he replied smoothly. The investor nodded. "Great leadership creates great teams." Daniel smiled. He didn't correct him. I remember pausing for a moment with my laptop halfway into my bag. Not angry, just surprised. When we got into the elevator afterward, I asked quietly, "You could have said I designed it." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "Laura, investors don't care about individual engineers," he said lightly. "They care about leadership." "I'm not just an engineer." "Of course you aren't," he replied quickly. "You're my partner." He kissed my forehead like the conversation had been settled. I told myself it didn't matter, but something inside me had taken note. Over the next few years, that pattern repeated in dozens of small ways. At conferences, Daniel spoke about our development team. In interviews, he said the company's success came from strong leadership and strategic vision. When journalists asked technical questions, he gave vague answers and quickly redirected the conversation back to growth metrics. My name rarely appeared anywhere. I was always present, just never visible. Then there were the board meetings. At first, I was invited as a core member of the founding team. I sat next to Daniel. We spoke together. But as Henderson Solutions grew, the structure changed. New investors, new executives, new hierarchy. Suddenly, I wasn't part of the decision-making conversations anymore. Instead, I was asked to attend in case technical clarification was needed. My chair slowly moved farther down the table, then closer to the door, until eventually I realized something unsettling. I had become the person people called when something broke, not the person they listened to when things were planned. Daniel explained it with the same calm confidence he used for everything. "It's optics," he said one night while scrolling through emails at the kitchen counter. "Investors want a clear leadership image. Too many founders can look messy." "Messy?" I repeated. "You know what I mean," he said. "One captain, one story. And I'm not part of the story." "You are," he said quickly. "Just behind the scenes." Behind the scenes. The phrase lingered in my head long after he went upstairs. That was around the time Daniel started spending more evenings at networking events. Dinners with investors, cocktail parties with potential partners, industry panels. I stopped going after a while, not because he told me not to, because I realized I didn't belong there. One night, about a year before everything collapsed, I did attend one of those events. It was a charity gala for a tech innovation foundation. Daniel was speaking on a panel about the future of artificial intelligence. I sat at a table with a few executives from other companies while he spoke confidently under bright stage lights. When the moderator asked about the proprietary AI systems Henderson Solutions had built, Daniel launched into a passionate explanation about vision, innovation, and leadership. He didn't mention me once. Afterward, a woman at our table leaned toward me and whispered, "Your husband is brilliant." I smiled politely. "He is very good at presentations." She laughed. "You must be proud to be married to someone that successful." I took a sip of champagne. "I am." What I didn't say was that I had written most of the algorithms he was describing. Later that night, while we were getting into the car, I asked him again about the ownership paperwork. 7 years had passed. The company was now valued in the billions. My name was still nowhere in the legal structure. Daniel sighed like I had brought up an annoying detail during an otherwise pleasant evening. "Laura," he said patiently, "this is complicated corporate law stuff. We'll handle it after the next funding round." "You said that 2 rounds ago." "And we will," he said. "Trust me." Trust me. That sentence had been the foundation of our entire relationship, and for a long time, I did. But something had begun changing inside me. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet awareness growing in the background of my thoughts. The realization that Daniel had built an entire empire around one central assumption: that I would always stay, that I would always build, that I would never question the role he had quietly assigned to me. And the most dangerous part, he wasn't entirely wrong, because for 7 years, I had done exactly that. Until the morning, a platinum pen rolled across a conference table, and the entire illusion finally cracked. The board meeting that Tuesday morning was supposed to be routine. Quarter revenue projections, investor reassurance, the kind of meeting that looked important, but mostly repeated numbers my systems had already calculated weeks earlier. Still, everyone showed up dressed like it was a battlefield. Executives with tablets, assistants hovering with coffee, board members flipping through printed reports that summarized the work I had automated long ago. I arrived 10 minutes early, laptop tucked under my arm. The conference room on the 14th floor was already humming with quiet conversation. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, reflecting off the massive marble table at the center of the room. My seat was the same as always, near the door, the unofficial corner reserved for people whose presence was useful, but not essential. Daniel entered last. He always did. A subtle performance he had perfected over the years. Let everyone settle first, let the room wait, then walk in like the main act. He looked immaculate. Dark navy suit, sharp tie, hair perfectly styled. He greeted the board with easy confidence. "Good morning, everyone. Let's talk about growth." And just like that, the meeting began. Slides appeared on the massive screen behind him. Revenue graphs, market share projections, performance analytics. Every number had been generated by my systems. Every predictive model had been trained on algorithms I had designed. Daniel spoke about them like a storyteller, describing a machine he personally invented. "Our AI forecasting engine has exceeded expectations again this quarter. Our automated contract system has significantly increased client retention. Our proprietary infrastructure allows us to scale faster than any competitor in the market." Every time he said "our," I felt a small tightening in my chest, but I stayed quiet. That was my role. Then it happened. Daniel reached for his pen, a ridiculous thing. Platinum fountain pen. Custom engraved. He had ordered it from some luxury boutique in Manhattan. He loved that pen, the way some men love sports cars. And in the middle of explaining a growth projection, it slipped. The pen rolled across the smooth marble surface of the table. Slow. Almost graceful. For a moment, everyone watched it like it was part of the presentation. The room went silent. The pen kept rolling. Across the table, past Richard's coffee, past Diane's tablet, until it reached the edge. Then it dropped. Right beside my shoe. The silence thickened. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room shifting, waiting. Daniel followed the pen's path. His gaze dropped to the floor, then lifted slowly and landed on me. His expression didn't change. No embarrassment. No apology. Just mild impatience. Pick it up. 2 words. Flat. Dismissive. The tone someone uses when asking a waiter to refill water. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, but the room reacted instantly. Richard froze with his coffee halfway to his mouth. Diane's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Marcus leaned back in his chair with a curious grin, like he had just discovered unexpected entertainment. The message was clear. This was a test, a social hierarchy moment. Everyone wanted to see how I would respond. The CEO had spoken. Would the quiet engineer obey? My jaw tightened. Inside my chest, something strange happened. Not rage, not sadness. Something colder, something clear. 7 years. 7 years of writing code until 3 a.m. 7 years of solving impossible infrastructure problems. 7 years of watching Daniel take credit for systems he barely understood. And now, I was being asked to pick up his pen in front of the board, in front of executives who had never once asked who actually built the technology running their entire company. Part of me wanted to leave it there. Let him crawl under the table himself. But another part of me, the part that had spent years studying systems and human behavior, realized something important. Moments like this reveal everything. So I smiled. Calmly. Slowly. I bent down, picked up the pen, held it for a second in my fingers. It was heavier than it looked. Cold metal. Expensive. Pointless. Then I placed it carefully back on the table in front of Daniel. "There you go," I said softly. Then I added, "Your Majesty." The reaction was immediate. Laughter erupted across the room. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. Marcus slapped the table. Diane tried to cover her mouth, but failed. Even Richard, the most serious man in the company, was chuckling into his coffee. Someone near the end of the table actually snorted. Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't thank me. He didn't even acknowledge what had happened. He simply took the pen, turned back toward the screen, and continued speaking. As I was saying, Henderson Solutions is projected to increase market penetration by another 12% next quarter. The meeting continued. Slides changed. Executives asked questions. Investors nodded. But I barely heard any of it. Because humiliation does something strange to your brain. It removes illusions. As Daniel spoke about success and growth and leadership, I began thinking about the systems running behind the scenes, the architecture I had designed, the security protocols only I understood, the administrative controls hidden deep inside the infrastructure. 3 years earlier, during a particularly stressful security review, I had built something called Fail-Safe Alpha. Officially, it was a protective system, a contingency designed to defend the company against catastrophic cyber attacks. Daniel had approved it immediately. He didn't understand the technical details. He just liked the phrase, fail-safe. But what he didn't know was that the system had a secondary function, a trigger. One that only someone with my exact credentials and knowledge of the infrastructure could activate. And when triggered, Failsafe Alpha didn't protect the company. It restructured it aggressively. I sat there listening to the board meeting continue around me, and slowly, quietly, a plan formed. Not a revenge fantasy, not an emotional reaction, a technical decision, a structural correction. Because Daniel believed he owned Henderson Solutions. He owned the brand. the investors, the contracts. But he didn't own the thing that actually made the company function, the systems. And the systems belonged to me. By the time the meeting ended 2 hours later, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. And more importantly, exactly when. Midnight. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual. Daniel's black Mercedes moved smoothly through the evening traffic, but inside the car, the air was thick with something heavy and unsaid. The moment we got in, he turned off the radio. That was always a sign. Daniel only turned off the radio when he was either irritated or calculating something. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence. Streetlights flashed across the windshield as we drove through downtown, but neither of us spoke for several minutes. Daniel's attention was fixed on his phone. His thumbs moved rapidly across the screen, typing messages with intense focus. Every now and then he angled the phone slightly away from me. It was subtle, but noticeable. I stared out the passenger window at the passing city lights and tried to ignore the tight knot forming in my chest. Finally, I broke the silence. I think the presentation went well today. My voice sounded calm, even to me. The Q3 numbers were solid. Daniel didn't look up. He simply lifted one finger in the air, not a gesture of patience, not a signal that he'd respond in a moment, just one finger raised between us like a wall. The universal symbol for be quiet. My mouth closed. A few seconds later, he dropped the hand and continued typing. No apology, no explanation, just silence. The message was clear. Whatever conversation he was having on that phone mattered more than the person sitting beside him. I leaned my head back against the leather seat. The interior of the car smelled like expensive cologne and polished leather. Usually it smelled like luxury. Tonight it smelled like distance. We drove the rest of the way home without another word. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the sun had already set. Our house looked exactly the way it always did. Minimalist. Modern. Sharp angles and huge glass windows that made the entire structure look like something out of an architecture magazine. Daniel loved the house. He had personally chosen every design detail. I had always felt like I was visiting a museum when I walked inside it. He stepped out of the car immediately, heels of his shoes striking the concrete with quick, efficient clicks. I stayed inside for a moment longer, just breathing. Then I grabbed my bag and followed him in. Daniel went straight down the hallway toward his study. The door closed with a firm thud. A second later, I heard the quiet but unmistakable sound of the lock clicking. Locked. Again. I stood in the foyer for a moment, staring at the closed door. His study had slowly become a room I wasn't allowed to enter. Not officially forbidden, just quietly restricted. I checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. My stomach growled, reminding me that the sad continental breakfast from the board meeting had been the only thing I'd eaten all day. So I did what I always did. I made dinner. Pasta. Cherry tomatoes. Garlic sautéed in olive oil. Fresh basil from the small herb pot on the kitchen counter. Cooking had always been one of the few things Daniel complimented me on, usually when we had guests. By 8 o'clock, the food was ready. I set 2 plates on the dining table. Then I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10, no footsteps, no sound from the study. Finally, I sighed and carried 1 plate back to the kitchen. By 8:15, I was sitting alone at the dining table, eating pasta in silence. The table was enormous. 8 seats, 7 of them empty. Halfway through my meal, I tried to remember the last time Daniel and I had eaten dinner together without clients or investors present. I couldn't. After cleaning the dishes, I carried my laptop to the living room and sat down on the couch. For a few minutes, I simply stared at the blank screen. Then I typed a question into the search bar. Is marriage supposed to feel like customer service? Hundreds of results appeared instantly. Relationship blogs, forum threads, articles about emotional labor. One comment on a discussion forum caught my eye. If you constantly wonder whether your relationship is normal, that's usually your answer. I closed the laptop. From Daniel's study, I could hear his voice through the wall, muffled, but animated. He was on the phone, and he was laughing. That laugh used to belong to me. Now it belonged to investors, board members, and whoever he had been texting in the car. I sat there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. And somewhere in the quiet space of my mind, the plan that had started forming in the boardroom began to sharpen. Around 9:30, I moved to my desk in the spare bedroom. I opened my laptop and started reviewing some code from a personal project, a small side system I'd been developing quietly over the past year, something that had nothing to do with Henderson Solutions, something that reminded me I could still build things for myself. I had my headphones on when my phone lit up. 10:42 p.m. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. I frowned. He was literally 30 feet away in his study. Why was he calling me? I removed my headphones and answered. Hello? His voice came through the speaker. Cold. Measured. Almost rehearsed. I've decided to terminate all contact. Stay away. Permanently. For a second, I thought I had misheard. Daniel, what? Consider this a formal separation, he continued. This marriage is over. I blinked. Daniel, we're in the same house. Why are you calling me? I didn't feel a face-to-face discussion was necessary. The words sounded strangely corporate. I want you out of the house by the end of the week, he continued. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow regarding the divorce process. The way he said it felt less like a conversation and more like a termination notice. I leaned back slowly in my chair. So that's it? I asked quietly. 7 years, and you're ending it with a phone call from the next room? This isn't a discussion, he replied. It's a notification. A notification, like I was an app he was deleting from his phone. Something strange happened inside me in that moment. Not heartbreak, not anger, something colder, relief. The kind of relief you feel when a truth finally stops pretending to be something else. I let the silence stretch for a moment. Then I spoke, my voice calm, too calm. Okay. There was a pause. Okay? Daniel repeated suspiciously. Yes, I said. If that's what you want, that's what you'll get. I leaned, but you might want to keep your phone charged tonight. Silence. Then his voice sharpened. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Just general advice. You never know when something important might happen. Are you threatening me? Threatening you? I laughed softly. Daniel, please, I'm just saying it's good to stay reachable. Important calls, emergencies, that sort of thing. I could practically hear the confusion on the other end of the line. Daniel hated not understanding what was happening. Anyway, I continued, thanks for letting me know about the divorce. Very professional. I paused. Good night, Daniel. And before he could respond, I hung up. My phone buzzed instantly with a text from him. I didn't read it. Instead, I typed 3 words. You will regret it. Then I set my phone to Do Not Disturb and opened a folder on my laptop labeled Insurance Policy. Inside it was a file named failsafe_alpha.py. And suddenly, midnight didn't feel very far away. The house was silent. Daniel was still somewhere down the hallway in his study, probably drafting emails to his lawyer, already imagining a future where our marriage ended as neatly as one of his corporate restructurings. He believed everything was under control. He believed the story had already been written. CEO divorces quiet engineer wife. Clean. Predictable. Manageable. What he didn't realize was that the real story hadn't even started yet. I turned back to my laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dark room as the folder opened. Insurance policy. 3 years earlier, during Henderson Solutions' second major expansion, I had started worrying about something most executives never consider. What happens when the person who built the entire infrastructure disappears? Companies always worry about hackers, competitors, market crashes. But they rarely worry about the architect, the one person who actually understands how everything works. So I built something. Part security protocol, part contingency plan, part leverage, fail-safe alpha. The code appeared on my screen in long, elegant lines. Server authentication protocols, automated system overrides, internal network access routes. To anyone else, it would look like a complex cybersecurity safeguard. which technically it was, but buried inside the program was a trigger condition, a command that could only be executed using a specific set of credentials, my credentials. And when activated, Failsafe Alpha didn't just secure the system, it restructured it violently. I leaned back in my chair and glanced at the time on my monitor, 11:47 p.m. Daniel had tried calling again. 4 missed calls, 6 text messages. I ignored them. If he was nervous now, he had no idea what the next hour would look like. I opened the system dashboard. Every core infrastructure node of Henderson Solutions appeared in neat rows. Contract automation systems, client databases, financial reporting algorithms, AI forecasting engines. Every one of them built on architecture I had personally designed. Daniel owned the company name. He owned the client relationships. He owned the contracts. But the thing that actually made those promises possible was sitting inside my laptop. And legally, he had never claimed ownership of any of it because he had never put my name on the incorporation papers. I checked the dependencies again. Everything was still connected, still functional, still waiting. At 11:55 p.m., I cracked open a bottle of beer from the kitchen. If the end of a billion-dollar tech empire was about to begin, it felt appropriate to have a drink. The clock ticked closer to midnight. My heart wasn't racing the way people might expect. I felt calm, focused, like I was debugging a particularly complicated piece of code. Because that was essentially what this was, a system correction. Daniel had built an empire based on a flawed assumption that the person holding the entire infrastructure together would never walk away. At 11:59 p.m., my fingers hovered above the keyboard. I took a breath. "You were right about one thing, Daniel," I murmured to the empty room. "I don't exist." I pressed enter. Midnight, and Henderson Solutions began to die. The first alerts appeared almost immediately. Server status monitors flashed red across the dashboard. Authentication failures. Contract automation errors. Database access interruptions. Failsafe Alpha moved through the system exactly as designed. Fast. Precise. Relentless. At 12:01 a.m., the automated contract system triggered its first cascade. 50 of Henderson Solutions' largest enterprise clients received automated notifications. Service termination notice. Due to immediate restructuring of operational infrastructure, Henderson Solutions will be unable to fulfill existing service agreements. I watched the activity logs scroll past, one contract after another, millions of dollars disappearing in seconds. By 12:03 a.m., the financial reporting system began triggering emergency shutdown alerts. Internal notifications were automatically sent to the board, investors, and senior executives. Critical infrastructure failure detected. Emergency protocols activated. Stock monitoring algorithms that tracked after-hours signals immediately picked up the alerts. Automated trading systems began adjusting their projections. I opened a financial tracking site. The numbers were already moving. $3.2 billion, $3.1 billion, $2.9 billion. The decline was almost hypnotic. A digital avalanche. At 12:07 a.m., the client database locked itself behind a new encryption layer. Not deleted. Just inaccessible to anyone except me. The AI forecasting engine started producing catastrophic recommendations. Immediate liquidation advised. Terminate non-essential contracts. Emergency cost reduction protocols activated. That part wasn't even in my code. The AI was simply responding to the chaos. I smiled slightly. By 12:10 a.m., I opened Henderson Solutions' internal Slack workspace. I still had administrative access. My status was set to invisible, which allowed me to watch the company panic in real time. The IT channel exploded first. Dylan, the night shift administrator, posted a message at 12:02. Anyone else seeing weird activity in the contract system? 30 seconds later. Never mind. Everything is on fire. Messages started pouring in. Server cluster down. Contract engine malfunctioning. Financial alerts everywhere. Is this a hack? Why are contracts being terminated automatically? Then the executive channel lit up. Richard, the CFO, appeared online. Why is Bloomberg reporting potential liquidation signals? Diane from operations responded almost immediately. This has to be a cyber attack. Marcus posted a screenshot of the market tracker. We just lost $800 million in valuation. A few seconds later, make that 1.2 billion. Then, at 12:15 a.m., Daniel finally appeared in the channel. The message was in all caps. Fix this now. I want everyone working on this immediately. Call our lead system architect. I laughed out loud. Lead system architect. That's what he called me when something broke. Marcus typed the obvious question. Daniel, isn't that your wife? The chat went silent. 15 seconds. 20. Then Daniel replied, call external consultants. Anyone. Just fix this. I refreshed the financial tracker. $3.2 billion had become $160 million. 17 minutes. The fastest collapse I had ever seen. At 2 a.m., someone in the IT channel finally noticed something interesting. All core systems are shutting down via authenticated admin commands. This isn't an external hack. Someone inside the network is doing this. Another message appeared. Only one person has that level of system access. A pause. Then someone typed, wasn't that Laura? Daniel's response came seconds later. Do not say her name. Too late. The realization had already spread. I opened one final terminal window and posted a message into the company-wide Slack channel. One simple line. Maybe try picking it up yourself. Then I revoked my administrative access, closed the laptop, and leaned back on the couch. For the first time in 7 years, I felt free. At around 3 a.m, the adrenaline finally began to fade. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. For the first few hours after activating Failsafe Alpha, I had watched everything unfold like a spectator. The Slack channels exploding, system alerts flashing red, financial trackers showing Henderson Solutions losing billions in value in real time. But eventually the chaos settled into a steady collapse, and suddenly there was nothing left to watch. I turned off the system dashboards and leaned back against the couch. The living room lights were still off. Only the faint glow from the street outside filtered through the tall windows. My empty beer bottle sat on the coffee table. The laptop was closed. My phone, still on silent, showed dozens of missed calls, most of them from Daniel. Some from numbers I recognized. Board members, executives, investors. I didn't answer any of them. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to fix. Nothing left to maintain. Nothing left to protect. Just silence. I sat there staring at the ceiling for a long time, letting the reality settle in. 7 years of my life had ended tonight. Not just a company, not just a marriage, an entire chapter of who I had been. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me toward sleep. I didn't bother going upstairs. I simply stretched out on the couch with a blanket and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. Memories kept replaying in fragments. Late nights writing code in our tiny apartment. Daniel kissing my forehead and saying we were partners. Our wedding day. The first investor meeting. The first office lease. The first big client contract. And then the boardroom. The pen. Pick it up. A strange ache spread through my chest. Not regret. Something more complicated than that. Grief. Because despite everything Daniel had done, part of me had loved him. Part of me had believed in us. Destroying Henderson Solutions hadn't just erased his empire. It had erased the life I once thought we were building together. Around 5 a.m, the sky outside began to lighten. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I remember was sunlight pouring through the windows. My neck hurt. My back hurt. But my mind felt clear. I checked the time. 9:58 a.m. Almost 10. For a moment, I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why everything felt so different. Then it hit me. Henderson Solutions was gone. I sat up slowly. My phone screen lit up the moment I picked it up. 73 missed calls, 41 messages, several news alerts. I opened the first headline. Tech giant Henderson Solutions suffers catastrophic overnight system failure. The next one. Henderson Solutions loses $3 billion in market value. Another. The fastest corporate collapse in state history. I exhaled slowly. The media had already picked up the story, which meant the board was probably in full panic mode. Daniel, too. For a moment, I wondered if he was still in the house. I listened carefully. Silence. No footsteps. No doors. No voices. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The house looked exactly the same as it had the night before. Clean. Perfect. Minimalist. Except now it felt empty. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. A memory flashed across my mind. 7 years ago, standing in our tiny apartment kitchen with Daniel, drinking cheap coffee while he talked excitedly about the future. We're going to build something huge, he had said. And we had. Just not together. I finished the coffee and headed upstairs to shower. When I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because I looked different, because the weight I had carried for years was suddenly gone. Still, one final step remained, because sooner or later, I would have to face Daniel and the rest of the board. I chose my charcoal gray suit, the one Daniel once criticized for being too flashy. Ironically, it was one of the cheapest suits I owned, but it fit perfectly. At 10:40 a.m., I grabbed my bag and left the house. The Henderson Solutions headquarters was only 15 minutes away. As I drove through the city, I could already see the story spreading. News vans parked near the building, groups of employees standing outside talking in anxious clusters, phones everywhere, cameras everywhere. When I walked into the lobby at 10:47 a.m., the atmosphere felt like a disaster zone. People rushed in every direction, phones ringing, voices raised. Someone near the reception desk was crying. Sandra, the receptionist, looked like she hadn't slept all night. When she saw me walk through the doors, her eyes widened. For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then she slowly lifted one shaking finger and pointed toward the elevators. No words, just understanding. The 14th floor was even worse. Coffee cups everywhere. Papers scattered across desks, employees whispering urgently in small groups. The door to the main boardroom was closed, but voices were shouting inside. I could hear Daniel. I straightened my jacket, took a slow breath, and pushed the door open. The moment I pushed open the boardroom doors, every voice inside stopped. It was like someone had cut the power to the room. The chaos froze mid-motion. Laptops still open, phones still in hands, coffee cups abandoned across the conference table, the same table where the pin had rolled the day before. Except now the atmosphere felt completely different. Yesterday it had been polished, controlled, corporate. Today it looked like a disaster zone. Richard, the CFO, sat hunched over his laptop, hair sticking up in strange directions like he had run his hands through it all night. Diane stood near the window, pacing back and forth, speaking in sharp whispers into her phone. Marcus looked slumped in his chair, scrolling through financial graphs with the hollow expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Daniel stood at the head of the table, exactly where he had stood yesterday, except the man standing there now looked nothing like the composed CEO from the previous morning. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. His tie hung loose around his neck. His hair, usually perfect, looked like he had slept in a wind tunnel. And his eyes were wild. When he saw me, the expression on his face changed so fast, it was almost fascinating to watch. Shock, relief, rage, fear, all in less than 3 seconds. You. The word came out like a crack in glass. I smiled slightly. Good morning. No one else spoke. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel took a step toward me. You did this. Not a question. A statement. I tilted my head. That depends. On what? He snapped. On whether you're asking as my husband or as the CEO. A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread around the table. Richard slowly lowered his coffee cup. Marcus stopped scrolling. Diane ended her phone call mid-sentence. Daniel's hands were trembling. "You destroyed everything," he said. His voice cracked slightly. $3 billion, hundreds of employees, years of work. Gone overnight. And somehow, I felt calmer than I had in years. I walked toward the conference table slowly. Every pair of eyes in the room followed me. When I reached the table, I set a thick folder down on the marble surface. The sound echoed. Daniel's gaze dropped to the folder. "What is that?" "Documentation." He didn't touch it. Documentation of what? Ownership. That word landed in the room like a stone dropped into water. Ripples of confusion spread across every face. Richard leaned forward slightly. Ownership of what exactly? I looked at him. Everything that actually makes Henderson Solutions function. Silence. Diane frowned. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I asked calmly. Daniel grabbed the folder and flipped it open. Inside were dozens of printed documents. Patent registrations, software architecture filings, intellectual property declarations, licensing agreements. Every single one of them had the same name listed under creator and legal holder. Mine. Laura Chen. Daniel's face slowly drained of color as he turned the pages. "What is this?" he whispered. "This," I said, "is what happens when you promise someone partnership for 7 years and never actually put their name on the paperwork." Richard leaned closer, reading the documents. Then his eyes widened. "Wait, these patents." He flipped another page. "These algorithms power our entire infrastructure." "Correct." Diane stepped forward. "That's impossible. The company owns those." "No," I said quietly. "The company licensed them." The room went completely still. Daniel looked up at me. "You're lying." "Am I?" I pointed to the documents in his hands. "You signed those licensing agreements yourself." Richard's voice turned hoarse. "Oh my God." Marcus leaned forward slowly. "You're saying Henderson Solutions never owned its own technology?" "Not exactly," I replied. "You owned the brand, the investors, the contracts." I tapped the folder lightly. "But the systems, the architecture, the AI engines, I built those. And because Daniel never finalized the partnership paperwork," I paused, "they were legally mine the entire time." Daniel slammed the folder onto the table. "You can't just steal the company." "I didn't steal anything," I said calmly. "I reclaimed my work." I reached into my bag and placed another document on the table. Incorporation papers, freshly filed. Richard picked them up and read the heading aloud. Tech Forge Solutions. Marcus blinked. "What the hell is Tech Forge?" I smiled slightly. "My company." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You started another company?" "Yesterday morning." "And the technology?" I shrugged. "I transferred my intellectual property licenses to TechForge at 7:32 a.m. Diane's phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking like someone had just punched him in the stomach. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You killed Henderson Solutions." I met his gaze calmly. "No, Daniel. You did that yesterday." He frowned. "What?" "When you dropped your pen." The memory hit the room instantly. Every executive there had witnessed it. The laughter, the humiliation, Marcus whispered under his breath. "Holy crap." Daniel stared at me. For the first time in our entire relationship, he had absolutely nothing to say. I straightened my jacket. "Good luck with the restructuring." Then I turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, I glanced back one last time. "Oh." I nodded toward the floor beside the table. "If you drop your pen again today," I paused. "Pick it up yourself." Then I walked out. And behind me, the empire Daniel built on my silence finally collapsed. By the time I stepped out of the Henderson Solutions building that morning, the story had already escaped the walls of the company. Tech news sites, financial blogs, market analysts, Everyone was talking about it. At first, the headlines focused on the collapse. Tech giant Henderson Solutions suffers catastrophic infrastructure failure. $3 billion vanish overnight. The fastest corporate meltdown in state history. But within hours, the narrative began to shift. Because journalists eventually ask the same question every time something collapses. Why? And when reporters started digging into the company's infrastructure, they discovered something fascinating. The entire system architecture, every algorithm, every AI engine, every automated contract process. All of it had been designed and registered under one name, Laura Chen, mine. By Wednesday afternoon, the story had evolved. The fall of Henderson Solutions and the engineer who built it. CEO's empire collapses after key architect walks away. The pen that broke a billion-dollar company. That last headline made me laugh out loud. I was sitting in my kitchen eating a grocery store rotisserie chicken when I saw it on my phone. Because after leaving the office that morning, I had done something surprisingly normal. I went to the grocery store. 7 years of corporate chaos had taught me something important. Revenge may be dramatic, but hunger is still practical. So I bought food. Then I went home. And by 6 o'clock that evening, I had officially incorporated TechForge Solutions. My company, my technology, my rules. The timing couldn't have been better. Investors who had previously been tied to Henderson Solutions were suddenly looking for somewhere new to put their money, and my inbox began to explode. Emails, LinkedIn messages, phone calls. Everyone wanted to talk. The first serious offer came the very next day. Michael Sanderson, a venture capitalist who had actually invested in Henderson Solutions 3 years earlier. His email was short and brutally honest. I should probably hate you for destroying one of my investments. Instead, I want to hear your pitch. Lunch tomorrow? We met at a quiet steakhouse downtown. Michael looked exactly like every Silicon Valley investor stereotype rolled into one person. Designer glasses, casual jacket that probably cost more than my car, a watch that could finance a small startup on its own. He ordered an expensive scotch and leaned back in his chair. What you did, he said, was either brilliant or completely insane. I smiled slightly. I'm hoping for brilliant, he laughed. Me too. Then he leaned forward. So tell me about TechForge. For the first time in years, I didn't have to hide behind someone else's title. I explained everything. Enterprise AI infrastructure, security architecture, custom system design, everything I had built for Henderson Solutions. Only this time, I owned it. Michael listened carefully. Halfway through the explanation, he shook his head slowly. You know what the real lesson here is, he said. What? Most companies have no idea how vulnerable they are. How vulnerable? I took a sip of water. Let's just say that if the person who built your entire system decides to walk away, you're probably in trouble. Michael laughed. That might be the most honest tech pitch I've heard in years. By the time dessert arrived, he had already made his decision. I'll fund it, he said. How much? $5 million for the seed round. TechForge was barely 48 hours old, and it already had its first investment. Meanwhile, Henderson Solutions was collapsing in real time. By Thursday morning, the company had lost 95% of its market value. Major clients were canceling contracts. Employees were updating their LinkedIn profiles, and the board had officially announced liquidation proceedings. Daniel's personal fortune had reportedly dropped by 97%. The man who had been featured on magazine covers just a week earlier was now the subject of business school case studies about corporate risk management. The media loved the irony, especially the pen. Every article mentioned it. That stupid platinum fountain pen had somehow become a symbol of the entire story. The pen that destroyed a tech empire. But the most interesting fallout happened inside the industry because executives and investors across Silicon Valley began asking uncomfortable questions. Who actually builds the technology inside their companies? And more importantly, are those people being treated like partners or like employees who can be replaced? By Friday afternoon, TechForge had already hired its first 2 senior advisors. Robert Blackwood, former CTO, brilliant strategist, and someone who had quietly resigned from the Henderson Solutions Board that same morning, along with Patricia Kumar, a veteran strategic consultant with an extraordinary network of investors. We met in my living room for our first planning meeting. Laptops open, coffee cups everywhere, whiteboard covered in ideas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. At one point, Robert leaned back in his chair and asked a question. "Every company needs guiding principles," he said. "What's yours?" I didn't even need to think. The answer had been obvious since that boardroom moment. "If you drop your pen," I said calmly, "pick it up yourself." Robert blinked. Then he burst out laughing. Patricia followed. "That," she said, "is the best corporate philosophy I've ever heard." And just like that, TechForge had its culture, not built on hierarchy, not built on ego, built on something much simpler: respect. Because the truth is, empires don't collapse because of revenge. They collapse because someone in power forgets the value of the people holding everything together. Daniel forgot that. And by the time he realized it, it was already too late. 3 months later, my life looked completely different. TechForge Solutions had grown faster than I expected. What started as a quiet idea on my laptop had turned into a real company with real momentum. We moved into a modest office downtown, about 1,500 square feet, nothing flashy, but entirely ours. My name was on the lease. My logo was on the door. And for the first time in years, I walked into a workplace where no one questioned whether I belonged there. Robert had taken the office next to mine. Patricia claimed the corner office with the best view. We hired a young receptionist named Katie, a computer science student who showed up to her interview with a portfolio full of side projects that reminded me of myself 10 years earlier. My desk was simple: solid oak, 2 monitors, a whiteboard full of architecture diagrams, and a small Spider-Man figure my nephew had given me for good luck. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. One afternoon, around 2:30, Katie buzzed my office. "Laura," she said hesitantly through the intercom, "there's someone here to see you." "Do they have an appointment?" "No." And she wouldn't give her name. I leaned back in my chair. Something in her tone told me exactly who it was. "Send her in." A moment later, the door opened, and Daniel Carter walked into my office. Except this wasn't the Daniel I remembered. His hair looked messy and unstyled, instead of the carefully styled look she used to maintain. She wore jeans and a plain sweater instead of the tailored designer suits she once treated like armor. But the biggest difference was in her eyes. They looked tired. Not just physically tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching an entire life collapse. For a few seconds, we just stood there, looking at each other. "You humiliated me," he said quietly. Her voice wasn't angry, just sad. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "No," I said calmly. "You humiliated yourself." She didn't argue. Instead, she slowly looked around my office. The simple desk, the whiteboard, the small team working through the glass walls outside. "This is nice," she said softly. "Thank you." He stood stiffly with his hands in his pockets. "The lawyers say I can't sue you," she admitted. I nodded. "Intellectual property law." "No," she corrected quietly. "Bad contracts." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she finally said what she had come to say. "I want to buy the technology back." My eyebrows lifted slightly. "Not all of it," she added quickly. "Just enough to rebuild Henderson Solutions. Investors are willing to fund it if we can restore our systems." "And without them?" I asked. She looked down. "We have nothing." There it was. The truth Daniel had refused to acknowledge for 7 years. The company had never been his. It had been the technology, and the technology had always been mine. "I'll give you 40% equity," she said quickly. "Real partnership this time. Your name on everything." For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because the offer was ridiculous, because it was exactly what she should have offered me 7 years earlier. I stood up slowly. "No." She blinked. "You'd be my partner." "I already was," I said, "for 7 years." Silence filled the room. "I'm not interested in rebuilding Henderson Solutions," I continued. "I'm busy building something new." Daniel looked around my office one more time. The desk, the monitors, the people working together outside. Then she nodded slowly. I understand. He turned toward the door. Daniel. She stopped but didn't turn around. That phone call, I said quietly. You said, I've chosen to terminate all contact. She nodded. Yes. Good. Because that was the last time you ever get to make decisions about my life. She stood there for another moment. Then she walked out. The door closed softly behind her. Through the glass walls, I watched her cross the reception area, past the TechForge logo, and step into the elevator. Gone. A few seconds later, Robert leaned into my office doorway. Was that her? Yeah. You okay? I thought about it. Really thought about it. Then I smiled. I'm better than okay. Because the truth is, freedom doesn't always come from winning. Sometimes it comes from finally realizing your worth. Daniel thought power meant owning the company. He was wrong. Power was understanding the system and knowing exactly when to walk away. So if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's simple. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room, especially the one who built the entire system. And if you ever drop your pen, pick it up yourself.